I never thought a Tuesday night shift would change my entire life. My name is Jessica, and I've been serving tables at Marcello's for the past 6 years. It's one of those upscale Italian restaurants where the wine costs more than my weekly paycheck, and the clientele drives cars I can't even pronounce the names of. But the tips are good. The hours work with my community college schedule, and honestly, I've gotten used to being invisible to people who matter. That night started like any other. I was exhausted from a morning statistics exam, my feet already aching in those mandatory black heels, and I had a headache brewing behind my eyes. I remember looking at my reflection in the kitchen's stainless steel door and thinking I looked about 10 years older than my 28 years. Dark circles, hair pulled back so tight it gave me a facelift, and that fake smile I'd perfected over thousands of shifts. Table 12 just sat down, Marco, the host, told me as he breezed past. Big spender, comes in every few weeks. Be nice. I grabbed my notepad and headed out to the dining room, weaving between tables of couples celebrating anniversaries and business deals being sealed over veal piccata. Table 12 was in the corner, the best spot in the house, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city lights. The man sitting there was probably in his 70s, distinguished in that way wealthy older men often are. Silver hair perfectly styled, tailored suit that probably cost more than my car, and these incredibly kind eyes that actually looked at me when I approached. That was the first thing I noticed. He really looked at me. Good evening, I said, launching into my rehearsed greeting. Welcome to Marcello's. My name is Jessica, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. Can I start you off with something to drink? He smiled, and it reached his eyes. Hello, Jessica. I'll have a glass of the Brunello, please. The 2007, if you still have it. Of course he knew the exact vintage. I nodded and turned to go, but his voice stopped me. How are you doing tonight? He asked. I turned back, surprised. Most customers asked out of politeness if they asked at all, but something in his tone suggested he actually wanted to know. I'm doing well. Thank you for asking, I replied automatically. He tilted his head slightly. Are you really? Because you look like you've had a long day. I laughed despite myself. Is it that obvious? I've learned to read people over the years, he said gently. It's a useful skill, but don't worry, you're handling it with remarkable grace. I felt my cheeks warm. Thank you. I'll get that wine for you. Throughout the evening, he ordered a full 3-course meal, and each time I came to the table, we talked a little more. His name was Robert Donovan, and he asked about my life with genuine interest. Where was I from? What was I studying? What did I dream about doing someday? It was strange. In 6 years of serving, I'd become a ghost in my own uniform, someone who existed only to refill water glasses and recite specials. But Robert saw me. Accounting, I told him when he asked about my major. I know it's not exciting, but it's practical, stable, and I'm good with numbers. But is it what you love? He asked, swirling the wine in his glass. I paused, unsure how to answer. Nobody had ever asked me that before. Love wasn't part of the equation. Bills were. Survival was. I used to want to be a teacher, I admitted, surprising myself. English literature. I loved books, loved the idea of sharing stories with kids who might need them. But teaching doesn't pay enough, and I have my mom to think about. She's sick, and the medical bills. I trailed off, realizing I was oversharing with a complete stranger. But Robert didn't look uncomfortable or annoyed. He nodded slowly. Taking care of family is noble, but sometimes we sacrifice so much of ourselves that there's nothing left to give. His words hit somewhere deep, a place I usually kept locked up tight. I blinked quickly and changed the subject. Can I get you dessert? The tiramisu is excellent. He ordered it, and we continued our strange, comfortable conversation between my trips to other tables. He told me about his life, about building a technology company from nothing in his garage 30 years ago, about his late wife who had passed 5 years earlier, about his estranged son who lived overseas and hadn't spoken to him in a decade. Money is a peculiar thing, Robert said as I refilled his water glass. It solves certain problems but creates others. It can't buy back time, or repair broken relationships, or give your life meaning if you haven't found it yourself. But it helps, I said, more bitterly than I intended. It helps a lot when you're trying to decide between paying for your mom's medication or your electric bill. He looked at me with such understanding that I felt tears threaten. Yes, he agreed. It does help with those things. Very much. When he finally asked for the check, I brought it over expecting a normal tip, maybe $50 or $60 given how much he'd spent. But when I opened the billfold, I froze. There was a check inside for $50,000, made out to me. My hands started shaking. Sir, This, this has to be a mistake. Robert was already standing, putting on his coat. No mistake, Jessica. Consider it an investment in your future. You deserve the chance to choose what you want, not just what you need. I can't accept this, I said, my voice rising slightly. Other diners were starting to look. This is too much. I don't understand. You can, and you will, he said firmly but kindly. I have more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes, and no one to leave it to who would appreciate it. But you, I can see you're someone who would use it to build something good. Promise me you'll think about teaching again. The world needs more people who care about stories. I was crying now, not caring that my mascara was probably running or that I looked like a mess. Why me? You don't even know me. I know enough, he said. Sometimes a small act of kindness can change everything. Let this be one of those times. He headed toward the door, then paused and turned back. Thank you for the conversation, Jessica. It was the most genuine interaction I've had in months, maybe years. And then he was gone, disappearing into the night while I stood there holding $50,000 and trying to understand what had just happened. Marco came over immediately. What was that about? Are you okay? I couldn't speak. I just showed him the check. His eyes went wide. Holy, Jessica, is this real? I think so, I whispered. The rest of my shift passed in a blur. I kept expecting Robert to come back, to tell me it was a joke or take the check back. But he didn't. I finished my tables on autopilot, my mind racing with possibilities. $50,000. I could pay off Mom's medical debt. I could quit my job and focus on school full-time. I could breathe for the first time in years. When I got home that night, Mom was asleep in her chair, the television flickering blue light across her thin face. She looked so fragile, so worn down by the illness that had stolen her strength and our savings. I covered her with a blanket and sat on the couch staring at the check in my hands. I didn't sleep. I researched Robert Donovan instead, finding articles about his company, his philanthropy, his reputation as a brilliant but reclusive businessman. Everything checked out. The check was real. This impossible, miraculous thing was really happening. The next morning, I went to the bank as soon as it opened. My hands shook as I endorsed the check, half expecting the teller to tell me it was fraudulent. But she processed it without issue, though her eyebrows rose considerably at the amount. Large deposit, she said professionally. It'll take a few days to clear, given the sum. That's fine, I managed to say. I walked out of that bank feeling like I was floating. $50,000. A number I'd never imagined having all at once. I called Mom from the parking lot, crying as I told her the story. This Robert sounds like an angel, she said, her voice weak but happy. You deserved something good, baby. You work so hard. We can pay off your bills, I said. All of them. And I can... My phone beeped. Another call coming in. I didn't recognize the number, but something made me answer. Is this Jessica Martinez? A man's voice asked. Yes, who's calling? My name is David Chen. I'm the attorney for Robert Donovan. I'm afraid I have some difficult news. Mr. Donovan passed away last night. He had a massive heart attack in his home. The world tilted sideways. I grabbed the car door to steady myself. What? No, I just saw him. He was fine. He was perfectly fine. I'm very sorry, David said gently. I know this must be shocking, but there's something else. I'm calling because Mr. Donovan's will was read this morning, and your name appears in it. I couldn't process what he was saying. Robert was dead. That kind, strange man who had seen me when no one else did, who had given me a gift I couldn't comprehend, was gone. Just like that. My name? I repeated numbly. I don't understand. Could you come to my office this afternoon? I think it's better we discuss this in person. I agreed, wrote down the address, and ended the call. Then I sat in my car and cried for a man I'd known for barely 3 hours, but who had somehow changed everything. David Chen's office was downtown, in one of those gleaming towers where power and money lived. I felt out of place in my jeans and sweater, but the receptionist was professional and kind, offering me water while I waited. David turned out to be younger than I expected, maybe mid-40s, with tired eyes that suggested he'd been up all night. He shook my hand and gestured to a chair across from his massive desk. Thank you for coming on such short notice, he said. I know this must all seem very surreal. That's an understatement, I replied. Can you tell me what happened? Was he sick? Not that anyone knew, David said. Robert's doctor said his heart simply gave out. At his age, with the stress he carried. Sometimes these things happen suddenly. He opened a folder on his desk. I've been Robert's attorney for 15 years. He was a good man, though few people truly knew him. His relationship with his son deteriorated after his wife died, and he became increasingly isolated. He mentioned that, I said quietly. Last night, at dinner. He seemed lonely. David nodded. He was. Which brings me to why you're here. He pulled out a document, several pages thick. This is Robert's will. It was updated yesterday afternoon, which is unusual but not unheard of. Sometimes people have premonitions, or they simply get their affairs in order when they feel it's time. My heart was pounding. What does this have to do with me? David looked directly at me. Robert left you $5 million, Jessica. The words didn't make sense. They were sounds without meaning, a sentence in a language I didn't speak. I'm sorry, what? $5 million, David repeated, along with a personal letter addressed to you. He slid both the will and a sealed envelope across the desk. I stared at them like they might bite me. This is insane. I was his waitress. I served him dinner one time. Robert was known for making unconventional decisions, David said, but he was always thoughtful about them. Whatever his reasons, he was very clear about this bequest. The will is ironclad, witnessed properly, and filed with all the correct procedures. What about his son? I asked. Shouldn't this go to him? The son receives the bulk of the estate, about $40 million. There are several other charitable bequests. And then there's yours. David leaned back in his chair. I won't lie to you, Ms. Martinez. This is going to attract attention. The son is already contesting the will, claiming undue influence. It will likely go to court. My stomach dropped. He thinks I manipulated Robert into giving me money. He doesn't know you at all, so he's suspicious. It's a natural reaction when large sums are involved. David's expression was sympathetic, but Robert anticipated this. He left detailed notes about his state of mind, his reasoning, and his intentions. He also left that letter for you. I suggest you read it. With trembling fingers, I picked up the envelope. My name was written on the front in elegant handwriting. I broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. Dear Jessica, if you're reading this, then I've passed on, and David has shared some news that probably feels impossible right now. Please know that I'm of completely sound mind as I write this, and every decision I've made is deliberate and considered. Last night, you gave me something I haven't had in a very long time. Genuine human connection. You didn't see an old man with money. You saw a person. You listened when I spoke, and you shared your own truth with remarkable honesty. In those few hours, I felt more alive than I have since my wife died. I've spent 5 years wondering what to do with wealth I no longer enjoy. My son and I are strangers to each other, separated by grief and mistakes I made when he needed me most. He'll inherit the company and most of my fortune, but I know it won't make him happy. Money never does, not by itself. You reminded me why I built this company in the first place. It wasn't for the wealth, though that came. It was because I wanted to create something meaningful, something that would help people. Somewhere along the way, I lost that purpose. But talking to you, hearing about your dreams of teaching, your sacrifice for your mother, your quiet strength, it reminded me of who I used to be. The $5 million is not charity. It's an investment. You have something rare, the ability to care deeply while still maintaining hope. The world tries to beat that out of people, especially those who struggle financially. But you've held on to it, and that's extraordinary. Use this money to build the life you were meant to live. Teach those students about literature and stories and the power of words. Take care of your mother without the weight of impossible debt. And most importantly, remember that your value isn't determined by your bank account or your job title. You matter because of who you are, not what you have. I expect my son will contest this will. Stand firm. You deserve this, even if you don't believe it yet. And perhaps, in time, this will force my son and me to have the conversation we should have had years ago, even if it happens through lawyers and courtrooms after I'm gone. Thank you, Jessica, for seeing an old man having dinner alone and treating him like a person worth knowing. That simple kindness gave me peace in my final hours. With gratitude and hope for your future, Robert Donovan. I read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down my face. David quietly pushed a box of tissues across the desk. He really was something special, wasn't he? I finally said, my voice breaking. He was, David agreed. And he was right about his son contesting. Harrison Donovan filed papers this morning. He's claiming you manipulated Robert into changing his will, that you took advantage of an elderly man. But I didn't even know he was going to die, I said desperately. The $50,000 tip was already incredible. I never expected anything else. I believe you, David said. And the evidence supports that. Robert updated his will yesterday afternoon, before he even came to the restaurant. He'd already decided to do this. He pulled out another document. This is his statement of intent, written and notarized. He specifically addresses potential challenges to the will. I felt like I was drowning. Yesterday, I was a waitress trying to scrape together rent money. Today, I was supposedly a millionaire being accused of manipulating a dying man. What do? I asked. First, you need to understand this will be a legal battle, David said seriously. Harrison has resources and motivation. He's not just fighting for money. He's fighting because he believes you somehow stole what should have been his. But his father chose this, I protested. Estranged children rarely see it that way. They see betrayal. David folded his hands on the desk. You'll need a lawyer. The estate will cover your legal fees, as Robert specified, but you should be prepared for this to take months, maybe a year or more. It will be invasive, stressful, and public. Maybe I should just give it up, I said quietly. I never asked for this. The $50,000 was already life-changing. I don't need $5 million. That's your decision to make, David said carefully. But consider what Robert wanted. He wrote that letter because he knew you'd feel this way. He wanted you to fight for this. Not for the money itself, but for what it represents. A chance to choose your life instead of just surviving it. I thought about Mom, about the medical bills that would never stop coming, about the dream of teaching I'd buried so deep I barely remembered what it felt like to want something beyond making it to next month, about Robert's kind eyes and his words about sacrifice. If I fight this, if I go to court, what are my chances? I asked. Honestly? Good. Robert was thorough. The will is solid. His intentions are clear, and you genuinely didn't know about any of this before tonight. But nothing is guaranteed in court. I looked at the letter again, at Robert's careful handwriting. He'd known this would be hard. He'd known I'd want to run away from it. But he'd asked me to stand firm. Okay, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Okay, I'll fight. Not because I think I deserve $5 million, but because Robert believed I did, and I owe it to him to honor that. David smiled slightly. That's exactly what he hoped you'd say. I'll start preparing our defense. But Jessica, you need to be ready. This is going to get ugly. He had no idea how right he was. The news broke 2 days later. Waitress inherits millions from wealthy client, screamed across local news sites and social media. My phone exploded with calls, messages, friend requests from people I hadn't talked to since high school. Reporters showed up at Marcello's asking for interviews. I had to stop going to work because the attention was too much. Mom and I moved to a small extended stay hotel under fake names, trying to escape the circus. She was proud of me for fighting, but worried about the toll it was taking. Baby, if this is too much, it's okay to walk away, she said one night, her hand weak in mine. I can't, Mama, I replied. Not because of the money, because Robert trusted me with this, and I'm not going to let him down. The court process started in earnest. Harrison Donovan's lawyers were aggressive, painting me as a gold digger who had seduced or manipulated a vulnerable old man. They dug into every aspect of my life, pulling up my bankruptcy from 3 years ago, questioning my motives for working at an expensive restaurant, suggesting I'd targeted Robert deliberately. Did you know who Robert Donovan was before he sat at your table? Harrison's attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Vance, asked during a deposition. No, I said honestly. I'd never heard of him. Convenient, she said with a thin smile. A wealthy man just happens to sit in your section, and within hours he's changing his will to leave you millions. You expect us to believe there was no manipulation involved? Yes, I said, meeting her eyes. Because that's the truth. I served him dinner. We talked. He was kind. That's all. Did you cry? She asked. When he gave you the $50,000 tip? Yes. And did you tell him about your mother's illness? About your financial struggles? He asked about my life, and I answered honestly. Patricia leaned forward. So you played on his sympathy. You made him feel sorry for you. My lawyer, a tough older woman named Margaret Foster, objected. Speculation and harassment of the witness. But the damage was done. That's how they wanted to frame this. Poor struggling waitress manipulates wealthy, lonely old man into giving her money. Never mind that Robert had been sound of mind, that he'd planned this before our conversation, that his letter clearly explained his reasoning. Harrison himself was called to testify, and watching him was painful. He looked so much like his father, the same silver hair, the same strong features. But where Robert's eyes had been kind, Harrison's were hard and angry. My father was lonely and vulnerable after my mother's death, Harrison said on the stand. He wasn't thinking clearly. This woman took advantage of that vulnerability for financial gain. Did you speak with your father regularly? Margaret asked during cross-examination. Harrison hesitated. We had grown apart. How apart? When was the last time you spoke to him before his death? Another pause. About 18 months earlier. 18 months, Margaret repeated. And in that time, did you visit him? Call him? Check on his well-being? Our relationship was complicated, Harrison said defensively. But not so complicated that you're unwilling to fight for his money, Margaret said coolly. The judge sustained the objection to that comment, but the point was made. Harrison had abandoned his father, and now he was outraged that Robert had found connection with someone else. The trial dragged on for months. Every day in that courtroom felt like a battle I wasn't equipped to fight. I watched experts testify about Robert's mental state, about undue influence, about estate law and inheritance rights. I listened to people who'd never met me describe me as manipulative, greedy, calculating. The prosecution brought in a psychologist who specialized in elder exploitation. Dr. Raymond Mitchell sat on the stand with his credentials displayed like armor, explaining how vulnerable older adults could be manipulated through emotional appeals. Loneliness is a significant risk factor, he testified, his voice clinical and detached. An isolated individual, especially one grieving the loss of a spouse, becomes susceptible to anyone who shows them attention or affection. It's a well-documented phenomenon. Patricia pounced on this. So in your professional opinion, could a young woman working in a service position exploit this vulnerability? Absolutely, Dr. Mitchell said. The power dynamic is particularly insidious because the target doesn't realize they're being manipulated. They believe the connection is genuine. I sat there listening to him reduce Robert's kindness and our conversation to some pathological weakness, and I wanted to scream. But Margaret had prepared me for this. We'd known they'd try to paint Robert as a victim and me as a predator. During cross-examination, Margaret approached the psychologist with Robert's complete medical records. Dr. Mitchell, you've reviewed these records, correct? I have. And what do they show about Mr. Donovan's cognitive function in the months before his death? Dr. Mitchell shifted slightly. They show normal cognitive function for a man his age. Normal, Margaret repeated. Not impaired, not diminished, not vulnerable to manipulation in any medical sense? Cognitive function and emotional vulnerability are different things, he argued. But you're testifying about his susceptibility to manipulation based solely on his emotional state, not any documented cognitive impairment. Emotional manipulation is a recognized form of elder abuse, which requires proof of manipulation, Margaret said firmly, which you cannot provide because you never met Mr. Donovan, never observed any interaction between him and my client, and are basing your entire testimony on speculation and generalization. The judge sustained several objections during that exchange, but Margaret had made her point. They had theories, but no actual evidence. But the prosecution wasn't done. They brought in former employees of Robert's company, people who testified about his grief after his wife's death, about how he'd changed, become withdrawn and melancholic. He wasn't the same man after Martha died, testified Linda Chen, who'd been his executive assistant for 20 years. He lost his spark, his drive. He seemed lost. Would you say he was vulnerable? Patricia asked. Linda hesitated, glancing at me for the first time. He was sad, but Robert was still sharp, still himself, just sadder. That small moment of honesty nearly made me cry, but Patricia wasn't satisfied. Mrs. Chen, in all your years working for Mr. Donovan, did he ever mention making substantial gifts to service workers or strangers? No, Linda admitted. So this behavior, leaving millions to a waitress he'd met once, was completely out of character? I wouldn't say that, Linda said carefully. Robert was always generous. He believed in helping people who needed it. This was just a larger scale than usual. The days blurred together. More witnesses, more testimony, more people picking apart every moment of that Tuesday night. They brought in a handwriting analyst who confirmed Robert had written the letter himself. They brought in the notary who'd witnessed his will update, who testified that Robert had seemed completely lucid and clear about his intentions. Did Mr. Donovan seem coerced or confused in any way? Margaret asked the notary, a stern woman named Barbara Walsh. Not at all, Barbara said firmly. I've notarized thousands of documents over 30 years. I know what duress looks like, and Mr. Donovan showed none of the signs. He was calm, deliberate, and very clear about what he wanted. But then Patricia asked her own question. Mrs. Walsh, did Mr. Donovan mention why he was making these changes to his will? He said he'd had a conversation that reminded him of what was important, Barbara replied. He seemed almost peaceful about it, like he'd made a decision that brought him clarity. A conversation with the defendant? He didn't specify with whom. The implications hung in the air. Every piece of evidence could be interpreted multiple ways, depending on whether you believed Robert had been a clear-minded man making his own choices or a lonely victim being exploited. The restaurant staff testimonies were particularly difficult. Marco took the stand and described the night in detail. How Robert had seemed engaged and happy during his meal. How he'd stayed for hours talking with me. "Did you observe Ms. Martinez doing anything unusual that evening?" Margaret asked. "No," Marco said. "She did her job, same as always. If anything, she seemed tired. It was a long shift, and she'd had an exam that morning." "Did you see her crying when Mr. Donovan left his tip?" "Yes. She was shocked, showed me the check. She kept saying she didn't understand why he'd done it, but Patricia's cross-examination painted a different picture. Mr. Rossi, in your 6 years of working with Ms. Martinez, had you ever seen her have an extended conversation with a customer like the one she had with Mr. Donovan?" Marco thought about it. "Not that I can remember. So this was unusual behavior for her? I mean, she was always friendly with customers. That's part of the job. But this went beyond friendly, didn't it? Multiple visits to the table when she wasn't taking orders or delivering food, personal conversations about her life, her struggles, her dreams." Marco looked uncomfortable. "I guess when you put it that way, yeah, it was more personal than usual." I wanted to explain that Robert had invited those conversations, that he'd asked the questions, that I'd simply responded honestly. But I couldn't speak, could only watch as they twisted something beautiful into something sinister. But I also heard from people who had known Robert. His employees testified about his character, about his generosity and clear thinking. The restaurant staff talked about the night he'd come in, how he'd seemed happy and engaged, not confused or easily swayed. David Chen presented Robert's meticulous records, showing how thoughtful and deliberate he'd been about updating his will. Then came testimony from Robert's doctor, Dr. Helen Yamamoto, who'd treated him for the past 15 years. She was a small woman with graying hair and the kind of competent, no-nonsense demeanor that inspired immediate confidence. "Dr. Yamamoto, what was Mr. Armao Donovan's mental state in the weeks before his death?" Margaret asked. "Completely sound," Dr. Yamamoto said without hesitation. "I saw Robert 2 weeks before he died for his regular checkup. We discussed his health, his exercise routine, his diet. He was sharp, engaged, asked intelligent questions about his test results. There was absolutely no cognitive impairment." "Did he discuss his personal life with you?" "He mentioned feeling lonely sometimes, but he was also talking about taking up painting again, something he'd done with his wife. He seemed to be finding ways to move forward with his grief rather than being consumed by it." "In your medical opinion, was Robert Donovan capable of making sound decisions about his estate?" "Without question," Dr. Yamamoto said firmly. "Robert was one of the most mentally acute patients I've ever had. Age hadn't diminished his faculties in the slightest." Patricia tried to shake this testimony during cross-examination, but Dr. Yamamoto was unflappable. "Doctor, isn't it true that cognitive tests don't measure emotional vulnerability?" "That's correct, but you're conflating two different things," Dr. Yamamoto replied. "Being sad or lonely doesn't make someone incapable of making rational decisions. Robert understood the implications of his choices. He wasn't confused or easily swayed. He was simply a thoughtful man who decided to do something generous." The testimony that affected me most deeply came from Sarah Chen, David's wife, who'd been friends with Robert and his late wife Martha for decades. She was in her 60s, elegant and composed, and when she took the stand, I could see tears already forming in her eyes. "Sarah, how long did you know Robert and Martha Donovan?" Margaret asked gently. 35 years, Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "Martha and I met in a book club, and we became close friends. Robert was always wonderful, devoted to Martha completely. Can you tell us about Robert after Martha's death?" Sarah took a deep breath. He was devastated. They'd been married for 42 years. Losing her broke something in him. For the first year, he barely functioned. We'd invite him over for dinner, and he'd just sit there, not really present. It was heartbreaking to watch. Did he eventually begin to heal? Slowly. Very slowly. About 2 years after Martha died, he started seeming more like himself. Not the same. You can never be the same after losing your partner, but more engaged with life again. He started talking about finding purpose, about making sure his life still meant something. "Did he mention wanting to help people?" "Constantly," Sarah said. "Martha had been a teacher before they had Harrison, and Robert used to say that was the most important work anyone could do. He regretted that he'd gotten so focused on building his company that he'd lost sight of what truly mattered. He wanted to do something meaningful with his wealth, something Martha would have been proud of. Margaret paused, letting that sink in. Did Robert ever mention meeting someone who reminded him of Martha's values? Yes, Sarah said, looking directly at me for the first time. He called me the night before he died. He was excited, more animated than I'd heard him in years. He said he'd had the most wonderful conversation with a young woman who still believed in the importance of education and helping others, despite struggling financially herself. He said it reminded him why Martha had loved teaching so much. Did he mention changing his will? He said he'd already done it that afternoon. He told me he'd found a way to honor Martha's memory by helping someone pursue the kind of work she'd valued most. He sounded happy, at peace, like he'd finally figured out how to move forward. Patricia's cross-examination was brief and ineffective. Sarah Chen was unshakable in her conviction that Robert had been acting out of genuine belief, not manipulation or confusion. Mrs. Chen, don't you find it suspicious that Mr. Donovan changed his will based on one conversation? Patricia asked. No, Sarah said simply. I find it beautiful. Robert spent 5 years searching for meaning after Martha died. Sometimes a single moment of connection can crystallize everything you've been thinking about. That's not suspicious. That's human. And through it all, I held on to Robert's letter, reading it every night before I slept, remembering why I was doing this. But the toll was immense. I lost weight, couldn't sleep properly, developed a constant anxiety that made my hands shake. Mom watched me deteriorate with worried eyes, but she never suggested I give up. That man believed in you, she'd say when I was at my lowest. Honor that belief, baby. See it through. The media coverage was relentless. Every day brought new headlines, new opinions, new strangers weighing in on whether I was a gold digger or a deserving recipient. My face was everywhere, my life dissected by people who'd never met me. I had to delete all my social media accounts after the death threats started. People sent messages calling me a thief, a manipulator, worse things I won't repeat. Someone spray-painted gold digger on the door of our apartment building, and we had to move again. But there were also letters of support. Teachers from around the country writing to say they understood the struggle of choosing between passion and survival. Former students of Martha Donovan's who said she would have loved Robert's final gesture. People who'd been helped by Robert's quiet generosity over the years, who testified to his character and his genuine desire to make a difference. One letter came from a woman named Catherine Liu, who'd received a scholarship from Robert 20 years earlier, when she'd been a struggling single mother trying to get her nursing degree. She wrote about how that help had changed her entire life trajectory, how she'd gone on to become a nurse practitioner and had helped hundreds of patients over her career. Robert never wanted recognition for his generosity, she wrote. He just wanted to help people who were trying to build better lives. What he did for you isn't unusual for him. It's just on a larger scale. He saw something in you worth investing in, and knowing Robert, he was probably right. Margaret read that letter aloud in court during her closing arguments, using it to paint a picture of who Robert really was, a man whose final act was completely consistent with how he'd lived his entire life. The day I testified was terrifying. I sat in that witness box, swore to tell the truth, and then told my story exactly as it had happened. No embellishments, no strategies, just the simple truth of one ordinary night that had turned extraordinary. Did you manipulate Robert Donovan? Margaret asked me directly. No, I said, my voice clear. I was kind to him because he deserved kindness, because everyone does. I didn't know who he was or what he planned to do. I just saw a person having dinner alone, and I treated him the way I'd want to be treated. Why do you think he left you this money? I thought carefully before answering. I think he was looking for meaning at the end of his life. I think our conversation reminded him of something important, some part of himself he'd lost. And I think he wanted to believe that kindness still mattered, that connection still mattered. Maybe I represented that possibility to him. Patricia's cross-examination was brutal. She tried to trip me up, to find contradictions, to make me seem calculating or dishonest. But I had the truth on my side, and I stuck to it no matter how she twisted her questions. Isn't it true that you specifically chose to work at an expensive restaurant to meet wealthy clients? She demanded. No, I said. I chose to work at Marcello's because the tips are good and the hours worked with my school schedule. I've served hundreds of wealthy clients over 6 years, and Robert is the only one I ever had a personal conversation with. How convenient that the one personal conversation happened to be with someone who died that night and left you millions. It's not convenient, I said, feeling my emotions rise. It's tragic. I wish Robert hadn't died. I wish he'd gotten to see his son again, to repair their relationship. I wish a lot of things, but I can't change what happened. I can only honor the choice he made and the trust he placed in me. When I stepped down from the witness stand, I was shaking. Margaret gave me an encouraging nod, but I couldn't tell if I'd helped or hurt our case. The waiting period after testimony ended was agony. Weeks passed while the judge reviewed everything. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat properly. Mom tried to keep me positive, but even she was worn down by the stress. "Whatever happens, we'll be okay," she told me. "We've gotten by on less before." But it wasn't about the money anymore, not really. It was about whether kindness meant anything, whether Robert's final wish would be honored, whether a system designed to protect the wealthy would see the truth of what had happened. The day the verdict came down, I sat in that courtroom feeling like I might throw up. Harrison was there with his lawyers, looking confident. I was there with Margaret, trying to breathe normally. The judge, an older woman named Sarah Brennan, entered and took her seat. She looked tired, and I wondered how many cases like this she'd seen, how many family fights over money had played out in her courtroom. "I've reviewed all the evidence and testimony presented in this case," she began, her voice measured and calm. "This has been a complex matter involving questions of testamentary capacity, undue influence, and the deceased's true intentions." My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear her words. Robert Donovan was, by all accounts and evidence, a brilliant businessman with full possession of his mental faculties until his death. His will was properly executed, witnessed, and filed. His statement of intent clearly articulates his reasoning for his bequests. Judge Brennan paused, looking directly at me. "The court finds no evidence of manipulation, coercion, or undue influence on the part of Jessica Martinez. Mr. Donovan's letter and supporting documentation demonstrate that his decisions were made independently and with clear purpose. While the circumstances are certainly unusual, unusual does not mean illegal or improper." I felt Margaret's hand squeeze my arm. "Therefore, this court upholds the will of Robert Donovan as written. The estate will be distributed according to his wishes." Case dismissed. The gavel came down, and suddenly it was over. I'd won. Robert's final gift would stand. Harrison stood abruptly and walked out without looking at me. I felt sorry for him, this man who'd lost his father and now felt betrayed by that father's final act. Maybe someday he'd understand what Robert had been trying to tell him, that money couldn't replace connection, that love had to be nurtured, not assumed. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed with questions I didn't answer. Margaret guided me to a waiting car, and we drove back to her office in silence. The reality was still settling in. "You did it," Margaret said finally. "You honored Robert's wishes." "It doesn't feel like winning," I admitted. "Harrison lost his father, and now he thinks I stole from him." "That's his burden to carry, not yours," Margaret said firmly. "You did nothing wrong. You were kind to someone who needed kindness, and he chose to reward that. The judge saw the truth. Now you need to accept it and move forward." Moving forward turned out to be its own challenge. The money was real now, sitting in accounts I could actually access. $5 million, a number so large it didn't feel connected to reality. The first thing I did was pay off every cent of Mom's medical debt. The relief on her face when I told her made everything worthwhile. "You don't have to worry anymore," I said, crying happy tears for the first time in months. "We can afford your treatments, your medications, everything." "Oh, baby," she said, pulling me close. Robert really was an angel, wasn't he? The second thing I did was quit Marcello's. I wrote a heartfelt thank you note to the manager, gave generous tips to all my coworkers, and walked out of that restaurant for the last time. 6 years of aching feet and fake smiles and being invisible to people who had more money than empathy. It was done. But then came the hard question. What now? I stood in the small apartment Mom and I had moved back to, staring at an acceptance letter from the teaching program I'd applied to on a whim. I'd been accepted for the fall semester, contingent on my ability to student teach while completing my remaining requirements. It was what Robert had wanted for me, what I'd dreamed about years ago before life got in the way. But suddenly it felt terrifying. What if I wasn't good enough? What if I'd romanticized teaching and the reality would disappoint? What if Robert had been wrong about me? "You're overthinking it," Mom said from her chair, where she was looking stronger every day thanks to treatments we could finally afford. "That man saw something in you worth investing in. Maybe it's time you saw it too." So I enrolled. That fall, I walked into a classroom as a student teacher, my heart pounding with equal parts terror and excitement. The kids were 8th graders, that perfect age where they're still young enough to be excited about learning, but old enough to think critically about what they read. My cooperating teacher, an experienced woman named Deborah, watched me with kind but assessing eyes as I introduced myself. "Hi, everyone," I said, my voice only shaking a little. "My name is Miss Martinez, and I'm going to be working with Mrs. Patterson this semester. I love books, I love stories, and I'm really excited to learn alongside all of you." A boy in the back raised his hand. "Are you the lady who inherited all that money? I saw you on the news." My face flushed. Of course they'd know. The story had been everywhere. "Yes," I said honestly. "That was me. It was an unexpected and complicated situation, but it's also what made it possible for me to be here today, pursuing this dream of teaching." "That's so cool," a girl in the front row said, "like a real-life fairy tale." "Not exactly," I replied, thinking of Robert's loneliness, Harrison's anger, the months of legal battles. It was a gift from someone who believed in the power of education and wanted to help me follow this path. And now I'm here, hoping to share my love of literature with all of you. "What's your favorite book?" someone asked. And just like that, we were off, talking about stories and characters and the way words could create entire worlds. I forgot to be nervous. I forgot about the money and the trial and everything except the joy of connecting with these young minds who were hungry for stories. After class, Deborah pulled me aside. "You're a natural," she said warmly. "The kids responded to you immediately. That's not something you can teach, that ability to connect." Her words echoed Robert's, and I felt tears prick my eyes. Maybe he'd been right about me after all. The semester flew by in a blur of lesson plans, grading papers, and discovering that teaching was even harder and more rewarding than I'd imagined. Every day brought new challenges, reaching the student who hated reading, managing classroom dynamics, finding creative ways to make Shakespeare relevant to 13-year-olds living in the digital age. But every day also brought moments of pure magic. Like when Marcus, the boy who'd asked about my inheritance, stayed after class one day to talk about a novel he'd just finished. "I never liked reading before," he admitted. "But this book you recommended about the kid trying to find his dad, it made me cry. Like actual tears. I didn't know books could do that." That conversation, that moment of connection, was worth more than any amount of money. As the academic year progressed, I found myself thinking often about Robert and what he'd tried to tell me that night at Marcello's. About finding purpose beyond just surviving. About the importance of genuine human connection. About using whatever resources you have to make the world a little better. I started a scholarship fund for students from low-income families who wanted to pursue teaching degrees. I donated money to literacy programs. I volunteered at youth centers, sharing my love of books with kids who might not have access to libraries or bookstores. But mostly, I taught. I showed up every day and did my best to see my students the way Robert had seen me, as people with value and potential, regardless of their circumstances. One afternoon, about a year after the trial ended, I received a letter. The return address made my heart skip. Harrison Donovan. I almost threw it away unopened, not sure I could handle whatever anger or accusations it might contain. But curiosity won out. "Ms. Martinez, I've been in therapy since my father died, trying to understand my relationship with him and my reaction to his will. It's been painful work, forcing me to confront truths I'd avoided for years. My father and I had a difficult relationship, especially after my mother passed. I blamed him for working too much when she was sick, for not being there enough. I stopped speaking to him out of anger and grief, and that silence stretched into years. By the time I realized how much time had passed, I was too proud to reach out. When he left you that money, my first reaction was betrayal. How could he give millions to a stranger instead of his own son? It felt like proof that he'd never loved me, that I'd been right to cut him out of my life. But after working through my feelings, I understand now what he was trying to tell me. He left me $40 million, more money than I'll ever need. But he left you something more valuable. Faith. Faith that kindness matters, that connection is worth more than wealth, that we're all responsible for seeing each other's humanity. You didn't take anything from me. My father gave you what he couldn't give me anymore because I'd pushed him away. That was my choice and my loss. I'm writing not to apologize, exactly, though I regret the pain the trial caused you. I'm writing to say thank you. Because fighting to honor my father's will, you forced me to really examine who he was and what he valued. You helped me see him more clearly than I had in years. I hope you're using the inheritance in ways that would make him proud. I suspect you are. Harrison Donovan. I read the letter several times, feeling a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying finally lift. Harrison didn't need my forgiveness, and I didn't need his approval. But this acknowledgement, This understanding somehow felt like a final piece of closure. I wrote back that evening, keeping it brief but sincere. Mr. Donovan, thank you for your letter. Your father was a remarkable man who helped me at a moment when I desperately needed it, not just with money, but with the reminder that I had worth beyond my circumstances. I'm teaching now, which is what he hoped I would do. Every day I try to pass along the gift he gave me, the ability to see people clearly and value them for who they are. I'm sorry you and your father ran out of time to repair your relationship, but his final act, whatever his intentions, has given both of us the chance to reflect on what truly matters. Maybe that was the gift he left us both. Wishing you peace, Jessica Martinez. I never heard back from Harrison, but I didn't need to. That exchange was enough. A small healing for wounds neither of us had intended to inflict. 2 years after Robert's death, I stood in front of my own classroom for the first time as a fully certified teacher. My own space, my own students, my own chance to make a difference. Mom was in the back row, healthy and beaming with pride, along with Deborah and Margaret and even Marco from Marcello's, who'd become an unexpected friend through all of this. Welcome to 10th grade English literature, I said to the students who would be mine for the next year. My name is Ms. Martinez, and I believe that stories have the power to change lives. I know because they changed mine. I told them about Robert that first day. Not about the money, but about the connection. About how one genuine conversation with a stranger had reminded him of his purpose and given me the courage to pursue mine. This class is about more than just reading books, I explained. It's about learning to see the humanity in others and in yourselves. It's about understanding that every person has a story worth hearing, including you. A girl raised her hand. What was the last thing he said to you? The man who helped you? I thought back to that night, to Robert walking toward the door of Marcello's and turning back one final time. He thanked me, I said softly. He thanked me for the conversation, for treating him like a person instead of just another customer. And then he was gone. That's sad, someone said. It is, I agreed. But it's also beautiful in a way. He spent his last few hours feeling connected and purposeful. He died knowing he'd made a choice that mattered, that would ripple out beyond him. Not everyone gets that. We spent the rest of the class talking about the books we'd read that year, about themes of identity and belonging and transformation. And I watched these students, these kids who had no idea how much they'd teach me in return, and felt overwhelming gratitude. That first year of teaching was harder than anything I'd ever done. Harder than the trial, harder than working double shifts at the restaurant, harder than watching mom struggle through treatments. Because teaching isn't just about delivering information or grading papers, it's about showing up every single day and giving everything you have to people who don't always appreciate it, who sometimes actively resist it, who are dealing with their own struggles you can't always see or help with. I had students like Marcus, the boy who'd asked about my inheritance on the first day, who slowly discovered a love for reading that changed how he saw himself. But I also had students like Brittany Chen, a brilliant girl who never turned in homework because she was working 2 jobs to help support her family, and I saw myself reflected in her exhausted eyes. Brittany, can you stay after class? I asked one day after she'd fallen asleep during our discussion of The Great Gatsby. She jolted awake, looking panicked. I'm sorry, Ms. Martinez. I was up late and... It's okay, I said gently. I'm not mad. I'm worried. Talk to me. What's going on? And she did. She told me about her mother's disability, about her father who'd left when she was young, about working at a fast food restaurant until midnight, and then a grocery store on weekends, about loving school but being too exhausted to give it the attention it deserved. I know I'm failing, she said, tears streaming down her face. I know I'm letting everyone down, but I don't know what else to do. My family needs the money. I saw myself in her so completely it hurt. The same impossible choices, the same bone-deep exhaustion, the same feeling of drowning while everyone else seemed to breathe just fine. You're not failing, I told her firmly. You're surviving, which is much harder, and I'm going to help you, okay? That's what I'm here for. I connected Brittany with the guidance counselor, helped her apply for the scholarship fund I'd established, worked with her teachers to create a modified schedule that accommodated her work hours. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. It was the kind of help I'd wished someone had offered me before Robert appeared in my life. Watching her graduate 2 years later, accepted to a state university with a full scholarship, was one of the proudest moments of my life. You saved me, she told me at graduation, hugging me tightly. No, I said, thinking of Robert. Someone gave me the tools to help you save yourself. That's all I did. Pass along what I was given. But not every story had such a clear, happy ending. I had students who struggled with addiction, with abuse at home, with mental health crises I wasn't trained to handle. I had students who dropped out despite my best efforts, who disappeared from school and sometimes from life itself. I learned that caring deeply meant hurting deeply, that opening yourself to your students' stories meant carrying some of their pain. There was Daniel Rodriguez, a sweet kid with a stutter who wrote the most beautiful poetry I'd ever seen from a 16-year-old. He reminded me so much of Robert, that same deep sensitivity, that same way of seeing the world through slightly different eyes. I encouraged him, celebrated his work, tried to give him the confidence he needed. But Daniel was being bullied, badly. And despite reporting it, despite interventions from administrators, despite everything we tried, it continued. One Monday morning, Daniel didn't show up to class. He never showed up again. His family moved him to another school, unable to trust that we could keep him safe. I cried that night, harder than I'd cried since Robert's death, because I'd failed. I'd seen Daniel's pain, his struggle, and I hadn't been able to fix it. Margaret, who I still met with monthly for coffee, let me grieve. You can't save everyone, she said gently. That's the hardest lesson of caring about people. You do everything you can, and sometimes it's not enough, but that doesn't mean you stop trying. How do you do it? I asked. How do you care this much and not break? Who says I don't break? Margaret replied. I break all the time, and then I put myself back together and keep going, because the alternative is becoming numb, and that's worse than breaking. Her words echoed in my mind during the difficult years that followed. Teaching through a pandemic when my students were isolated and struggling, watching them log into virtual classes from homes where they weren't safe or supported, trying to maintain connection through a screen. Teaching through budget cuts that meant losing art and music programs, things that gave some kids their only joy. Teaching through lockdown drills, and the very real fear that violence could come to our school at any moment. But there were also moments of pure magic that made all the hardship worthwhile. Like the day Keisha Williams, a student who'd told me she hated reading because it was for white people, stayed after class to discuss Toni Morrison with tears in her eyes. I didn't know books could be about people like me, she said. I didn't know our stories mattered enough to be in books. They've always mattered, I told her. Sometimes it just takes the right book at the right time to help you see that. Or the afternoon when my entire class spontaneously acted out a scene from Romeo and Juliet, turning our serious discussion into an improvised performance that had everyone laughing and engaged in ways I'd never managed through lectures and tests. In that moment, watching them collaborate and create and find joy in Shakespeare, I understood why Robert had believed so strongly in the power of education. Years into my teaching career, I started a creative writing club for students who wanted to explore storytelling beyond the curriculum. We met after school twice a week, and those sessions became sacred time. Kids who were invisible in their regular classes found their voices in our circle. They wrote about their lives, their fears, their dreams, and they listened to each other with the kind of attention that's increasingly rare in our fractured world. One student, a quiet girl named Amelia Park, wrote a story about her grandmother who'd survived the Korean War. Through her narrative, Amelia processed her family's trauma and her own struggle with depression. She read it aloud to the group with a shaking voice, and when she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. That's the power of story, I told them all. You just witnessed Amelia transform pain into something beautiful, something that connects us to her experience and to each other. That's what literature does. That's why it matters. Amelia continued writing, got into a prestigious college creative writing program, and published her first short story collection before she was 25. She dedicated it to Ms. Martinez, who taught me that my story mattered. I kept that book on my desk, next to Robert's framed letter, as a reminder of why I showed up every day even when it was hard. Gratitude to Robert for seeing me when I was invisible, for believing I was worth investing in, for trusting me with his final gift. Gratitude to Mom for never giving up, even when things were impossibly hard, for showing me what real strength looked like. Those final 3 years with her, after the trial ended and the medical debt was gone, were precious beyond measure. We took a trip to the beach, something we'd never been able to afford before. I watched her stand in the ocean water, her thin arms raised to the sun, and heard her laugh with pure joy. I never thought I'd see the ocean again, she told me that day. Thank you, baby. Thank you for fighting so hard for us. Robert gave us this, I said. I'm just grateful we got to use it together. We spent long evenings talking about everything and nothing, making up for all the years when exhaustion and worry had dominated our conversations. She told me stories about my father, who died when I was 6, about their young love and the dreams they'd had before illness took him too soon. He'd be so proud of you, she said. A teacher, just like you always wanted, making a real difference in kids' lives. I wish he could have met Robert, I said. I think they would have understood each other. Mom smiled. Maybe they're somewhere together now, two kind souls who believed in helping others. When she died 3 years after the trial, peacefully in her sleep after a wonderful final few years, where money was never a worry and we could just enjoy being together, I felt both devastating grief and deep gratitude. Her last words to me were about Robert. That man was an angel, she said, squeezing my hand. He gave us both the gift of time without fear. Don't ever forget that, baby. I haven't forgotten. I never will. I buried her with a photo of us at the beach, both of us laughing, genuinely happy for the first time in years. And I scattered some of her ashes in the ocean she'd loved so much, watching them disappear into the waves while I whispered thank you to both her and Robert for teaching me what love really looked like. The scholarship fund became my other way of honoring their legacies. I named it the Martha and Robert Donovan Education Fund, wanting to acknowledge both the man who'd helped me and the woman whose values had inspired him. Every year, we awarded full scholarships to 10 students from low-income backgrounds who wanted to pursue teaching degrees. The first year we gave out scholarships, I sat on the selection committee reading application after application from students who reminded me of myself. Their essays spoke of financial struggles, family responsibilities, dreams deferred but not forgotten. Each one was a story worth hearing, a person worth investing in. One applicant, a young man named Thomas Wright, wrote about working as a janitor in the elementary school he'd attended as a child. I watch these teachers every day, he wrote, and I see how they change lives. I see kids who come from nothing, just like I did, and I watch them light up when someone believes in them. I want to be that person for other kids. I want to show them that where you start doesn't determine where you finish. Thomas got one of the scholarships. 5 years later, he was teaching 3rd grade in the same neighborhood where he'd grown up, making a difference for the next generation. He sent me a photo of his classroom on his first day, and I cried looking at his face, so full of purpose and hope. We expanded the fund over the years, adding mentorship programs and summer workshops where scholarship recipients could connect with each other and with experienced teachers. We created a network of people who understood the unique challenges of pursuing education while managing financial hardship, people who could support each other through the difficult journey. One summer, during a workshop I was leading on classroom management, a scholarship recipient named Jennifer Lopez raised her hand. Ms. Martinez, how do you deal with imposter syndrome? I keep thinking I don't deserve this scholarship, that I'm not good enough to become a teacher. Her question silenced the room. I could see the same fear reflected in every face, the same doubt that had plagued me during the trial and beyond. I still struggle with it, I admitted. Even now, years into my teaching career, I sometimes wake up wondering if I'm making a real difference. But here's what I've learned. Worthiness isn't about being perfect or having all the answers. It's about showing up with genuine care and doing your best. Every single person in this room was chosen because we saw something special in you, something that will make you an exceptional teacher. You belong here, even when it doesn't feel that way. But what if we fail? Someone else asked. You will fail, I said honestly. You'll have lessons that bomb, students you can't reach, days where you question everything. Teaching is humbling work, but those failures don't define you. What defines you is whether you learn from them and keep trying. Robert Donovan saw potential in me that I couldn't see in myself. I'm paying that forward by seeing potential in all of you. Now you need to start seeing it in yourselves. The scholarship fund taught me something crucial, that Robert's gift wasn't just about money. It was about belief, about seeing people's potential and giving them the resources to develop it. Every scholarship we awarded was an extension of what he'd done for me, a ripple continuing to spread outward. Gratitude to Margaret for fighting for what was right, to Deborah for teaching me how to teach, to every person who'd been part of this unlikely journey. Margaret became more than my lawyer. She became a mentor and friend. We met monthly for coffee, and she'd ask about my teaching and share stories from her legal practice. You know what makes me happiest about your case? She said one afternoon, stirring cream into her coffee. It's not that we won, though that was satisfying. It's that you actually used the money the way Robert hoped you would. So many people who inherit wealth squander it or let it change them for the worse. But you took this gift and built something meaningful with it. I'm terrified of wasting what he gave me, I confessed. Every decision feels weighted with responsibility to him. That's good, Margaret said. That awareness will keep you grounded. But don't let it paralyze you. Robert wanted you to live fully, not spend your life second-guessing every choice. She was right, as usual. I'd been so focused on being worthy of the inheritance that I'd forgotten to actually live the life it made possible. I started saying yes to things I'd always denied myself: travel, hobbies, relationships. I went to Paris and saw the museums I'd only read about. I took up painting, something I'd loved as a child but abandoned as impractical. I even started dating, though that proved more complicated. My first serious relationship after the trial was with another teacher, a history instructor named Michael Torres. He was kind, intelligent, passionate about education, but he was also intimidated by my story, by the money, by the public nature of my life. "I feel like I'm dating a celebrity," he said one night when we were having dinner. "People recognize you, want to talk about Robert and the trial. I know it's not your fault, but it's hard to feel like we have privacy." "I hate that too," I admitted. "I never wanted to be famous or recognized. I just wanted to teach." "But you're not just a teacher now," Michael said. "You're Jessica Martinez, the waitress who inherited millions. That's your identity whether you want it or not." We broke up a few months later, amicably but sadly. He needed someone whose life was simpler, less complicated by public scrutiny and the weight of extraordinary circumstances. I understood, but it hurt nonetheless. It took me years to realize that anyone who couldn't handle my story probably wasn't right for me anyway. The inheritance wasn't just money, it was part of who I'd become, part of the journey that shaped me. Someone who couldn't accept that couldn't really accept me. But most of all, gratitude for the reminder that kindness matters, that seeing each other's humanity, even in brief encounters, can change everything, that we're all capable of making choices that ripple out beyond ourselves in ways we might never fully understand. I still have Robert's letter. It's framed on the wall of my classroom, a reminder to my students and myself about what's truly valuable in this life. You matter because of who you are, not what you have. Those words guide me every day, in every interaction with my students, in every decision about how to use the resources I've been given, in every moment when I'm tempted to judge someone by their surface instead of their substance. Sometimes students ask about the lawsuit, about what it was like to fight for Robert's will in court. I tell them the truth. It was terrifying and painful, and there were days I wanted to give up. But I kept going, I explain, because Robert had believed in me, and I owed it to him to believe in myself. Sometimes we have to fight for the gifts we're given, not because we think we deserve them, but because refusing them would dishonor the giver. Years have passed now since that Tuesday night that changed my life. The money is still there, carefully managed and slowly being used for purposes that would make Robert proud. The scholarship fund has helped dozens of students pursue teaching degrees. The literacy programs reach hundreds of kids every year, and my classroom continues to be a place where stories are shared and humanity is honored. Mom passed away 3 years after the trial, peacefully in her sleep after a wonderful final few years where money was never a worry and we could just enjoy being together. Her last words to me were about Robert. "That man was an angel," she said, squeezing my hand. "He gave us both the gift of time without fear. Don't ever forget that, baby." I haven't forgotten. I never will. Sometimes, when I'm having a particularly challenging day in the classroom, when nothing seems to be working, and I'm questioning every choice I've made, I think about Robert sitting at table 12, asking me if I was really doing well, seeing through my automatic responses to the truth underneath. I think about his words regarding sacrifice, about how we sometimes give away so much of ourselves that there's nothing left to give. I make sure my students understand that taking care of yourself isn't selfish, that you can't pour from an empty cup, that self-knowledge and self-respect are the foundations of genuine connection with others. And I think about his final gift, not the money, but the faith. Faith that I had something valuable to offer the world, that my dreams were worth pursuing, that my kindness and care for others wasn't weakness but strength. That's what I try to pass along now, to every student who walks through my classroom door. You have value. Your story matters. Your choices ripple out in ways you can't always see, but that make a difference nonetheless. One evening, several years after everything, I was leaving school late after a particularly long day. A student had stayed for extra help, and we'd spent an hour talking through her college essay about her immigrant parents and her dream of becoming a doctor despite everyone telling her it was impossible. "You can do this," I'd told her. "Don't let anyone convince you that your dreams are too big or that you don't deserve to pursue them." As I walked to my car, I saw an elderly man sitting on the bench outside the school, looking lost. Without thinking, I stopped. Are you okay? I asked. Can I help you with something? He looked up and I saw the loneliness in his eyes, the kind that comes from feeling invisible in a world that's forgotten you. I'm just waiting for my daughter, he said. She's late picking me up. She's always late. Would you like to wait inside where it's warmer? I offered. I can stay with you until she arrives. His face brightened slightly. Would you mind? I don't want to be a bother. No bother at all, I said, helping him up. We sat in the lobby and I listened as he told me about his life, his career as an engineer, his late wife who'd loved orchids, his relationship with his daughter that had become strained over the years. She's busy, he said. Always busy. I understand. But sometimes I wish we could just talk. You know? Really talk, like people used to. I know exactly what you mean, I said softly. When his daughter finally arrived, full of apologies and stress about traffic, she barely looked at her father or me before hurrying him out the door. But the old man turned back and smiled at me. Thank you, he said, for seeing me. And I understood, finally and completely, what Robert had been trying to tell me about kindness and connection and the small acts that change everything. It wasn't about grand gestures or life-changing gifts. It was about this, seeing each other, really seeing each other, in a world that makes it so easy to look away. I stood there in the empty lobby, tears streaming down my face, grateful beyond measure for a Tuesday night years ago when a lonely man sat at my table and reminded me what it meant to be human. That's the inheritance Robert really left me. Not $5 million, though that changed my practical circumstances in ways I'll never take for granted. The real gift was the reminder that we all have the power to transform lives through simple acts of kindness and genuine connection. Every day I teach, I honor that gift. Every student I really see, continues Robert's legacy. Every moment I choose connection over convenience, humanity over habit, I'm paying forward what he gave me. Sometimes I wonder what Robert would think if he could see me now. Would he be proud of the teacher I've become? Would he feel his investment was worthwhile? Would he understand how much his faith in me continues to shape every choice I make? I like to think he would. I like to think that somewhere, somehow, he knows that his final act of kindness created ripples that continue to spread, touching lives he never met, making the world a little bit better in ways both large and small. And that, I've learned, is what it means to truly matter. Not the wealth you accumulate or the accolades you receive, but the way you see people and the choices you make about how to use whatever resources you have, whether that's $5 million or simply 5 minutes to sit with someone who's lonely. We're all writing our legacies every single day, in every interaction, through every choice. Robert taught me that. And now I spend my life teaching it to others, hoping that someday, when my own story ends, I'll have made the same kind of difference in someone's life that he made in mine. That Tuesday night at Marcello's wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of everything. And I'm still living that beginning, still discovering what it means to be worthy of the gift I was given, still learning how to see and be seen in a world that desperately needs more connection. Thank you, Robert. For the money, yes, but more importantly for the reminder that kindness changes lives. I promise I'll never forget. And I'll spend the rest of my days making sure others don't forget either, because in the end, that's all any of us can hope for. To be seen, to be remembered, and to leave the world a little bit better than we found it. Robert did that for me, and now I'm doing my best to do it for others. One person at a time, one connection at a time, one act of kindness at a time. That's the real inheritance. And it's worth more than all the money in the world.